So welcome back to this second video in the presentation of Streeter's other synoptic solution, the Matthew Conflator hypothesis. My name is Alan Garrow and I'm a visiting scholar at the University of Sheffield. At the end of the last video, we arrived at the Matthew Conflator hypothesis, or Streeter's other synoptic solution. And I'm going to begin now to try and test this hypothesis against the two mainstream alternatives, the two-document hypothesis, which holds that Matthew and Luke independently use Mark and Q, and the Farrer hypothesis, which holds that Luke uses Matthew along with Mark and priority. Now, before going further, it's worth taking a moment to think what a good hypothesis looks like. Quite a helpful illustration is to think of it in terms of a multi-vehicle traffic accident. In such cases, accident reconstructors will go to the scene, they'll measure the skid marks, the damage to the cars themselves, damage to the street furniture, and they'll try and put those pieces of data into a coherent, overarching narrative where each participant behaves in a consistent manner. So our task is similar. We have to look at individual pieces of data and then try and work them into one overarching story. Now, in the case of the synoptic problem, the pieces of data are not skid marks and damage to vehicles. They're things like sometimes Matthew and Luke agree extensively verbatim, or sometimes Matthew and Luke agree against Mark, things like that. And so we're going to make our way through those individual pieces of data, and then in the final video, see if we can put them together into one overarching story under one of these hypotheses, and particularly testing the Matthew Conflator hypothesis for that result. So our first piece of data is that Matthew and Luke sometimes extensively agree verbatim in the double tradition. Here's some examples. This is John's preaching on repentance. You can see that the green material is very substantially similar in Luke and Matthew, and similarly here, Jesus' lament over Jerusalem and the return of the evil spirit. And here's the fourth most agreeing passage between Luke and Matthew, Jesus' thanksgiving to the Father. Now, according to the two-document hypothesis, the reason why Matthew and Luke agree so closely is not because one has copied the other, it's because they have both been remarkably faithful to Q. And it's a serious problem for the two-document hypothesis that it requires them to be so faithful to Q. Indeed, they need to have a compound faithfulness of 85% in this fourth most agreeing passage, which means that if Luke was 95% agreeing with Q, then Matthew would need to be 90% agreeing with Q in order to achieve this result. Now, if we compare Luke and Matthew's behaviour in their treatment of Mark, we get a rather different story. Here's the fourth most agreeing passage of Mark, Luke and Matthew, and it's nothing like 85% agreement. In fact, there's only 33% compound agreement between all three texts. So it doesn't look as though Matthew and Luke are in the habit of copying their sources with the kind of faithfulness which the two-document hypothesis requires. Now, sometimes our supporters of Q suggest that the reason why Matthew and Luke are so faithful to it is because it has more incidents of the words of Jesus. Now, as it happens, we have a means of testing this conjecture because although Mark's Gospel is a lot longer than the double tradition, it has roughly the same number of words of Jesus in it as the double tradition has. And so we can do a rough like-for-like comparison. Now, this means that if, under the two-document hypothesis, we would expect that Matthew and Luke's faithfulness to the words of Jesus in Q would be roughly the same as their faithfulness to the words of Jesus in Mark. But actually, there's a very big difference. These diagrams indicate strings of verbatim agreement. So this bar down here indicates that there are 4 occasions where there are strings of 10 words each. Just gives a visual impression of how much more likely Matthew and Luke are to agree exactly with Q than they are to agree with Mark. So this suggests that something else is going on, either that Matthew is using Luke or that Luke is using Matthew directly, and we can test those possibilities. What if Luke used Matthew? Then we'd expect that his faithfulness to the words of Jesus in Matthew would be roughly the same as his faithfulness to the words of Jesus in Mark. And the figures are closer, but there's still quite a big difference. It looks like we'd have to think of a reason why Luke would be so much more faithful to the words of Jesus in Matthew than in Mark. What about if Matthew used Luke? Then we'd expect that his faithfulness to the words of Jesus in Luke would be roughly the same as his faithfulness to the words of Jesus in Mark. And this is indeed the picture that emerges. It looks as though Matthew does treat Luke much as he treats Mark. And that would provide a very credible explanation for these very high agreement passages. Matthew and Luke agree almost exactly. So, the first piece of data is that Matthew and Luke sometimes extensively agree verbatim in the double tradition, and the most probable explanation for that is that Matthew closely copied Luke, just as he also sometimes closely copies Mark. Here's our second piece of data. It's that Matthew and Luke sometimes barely agree verbatim in the double tradition. So here are some very different sorts of passages. In Woe to the Scribes and the Pharisees, you can see that although Matthew and Luke are talking about the same subject, they use a very different vocabulary. Similarly, in On Retaliation and On Love of One's Enemies, something else is going on here, and whatever is going on, it isn't straightforward copying between Matthew and Luke. There's a key to a possible explanation elsewhere in Matthew and Luke, where they have an overlap with Mark, because here, in the parable of the mustard seed, Matthew deviates from Luke quite substantially, but if he knew Mark, that would explain why. That Matthew is trying to honour both Mark and Luke, and so he's drawn away from Luke's account by the influence of Mark. Something similar in the Beelzebul controversy. There are some gaps in Matthew's faithfulness to Luke, which are accounted for by a faithfulness to Mark instead. The same is possible in the double tradition, that the reason why Matthew is rather unlike Luke's account of On Retaliation and Love of Enemies is that he knows another version of these same sayings, and he's trying to conflate the two together, and that's what draws him away from Luke. So sometimes Matthew and Luke barely agree verbatim in the double tradition, and the Matthew Conflator hypothesis proposes that this is because Matthew combines Luke and Q, just as he also combines Luke and Mark when they address the same subject. Here's the third piece of data. Sometimes Matthew and sometimes Luke preserve a saying in its more original form. You'll be familiar from the first video with the concept of alternating primitivity. And according to Streeter, this phenomenon can happen if Matthew and Luke independently use Q, and he's right about that. So here we can have Matthew and Luke taking something from Q and making it their own, taking something from Q and preserving it in its original form, which means that sometimes Matthew and sometimes Luke is more original. But the same result can be arrived at by a different means. If Luke draws on Q, then he may take and adapt some element of Q, he may take and preserve some element of Q. If Matthew were to conflate Luke and Q together, then sometimes he may take something from Luke, and sometimes he may take something from Q, which is more original than Luke, so that you arrive at sometimes Luke is more original, and sometimes Matthew is more original. So the fact that sometimes Matthew and sometimes Luke preserves a saying in its more original form may be because Matthew and Luke made independent use of Q, or it may be because Luke used Q in quotes and Matthew combined Luke and Q in quotes. In the next video I'll come to the fourth piece of data. It's quite a substantial one, so it has a whole video to itself, and it's the observation that there are two schools of scribal activity are observable in the way that Matthew and Luke behave. So how can we find a way of allowing them to behave consistently?